Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, Robert P. George and Cornel West in Conversation, a discussion on how to foster dialogue and friendships across the political aisle. I'm Terry Rhodes, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's event is sponsored by the UNC Program for Public Discourse and the North Carolina Study Center. The Program for Public Discourse seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation, enabling them to be better citizens, civic leaders, and stewards of our democracy. It is a central part of the mission of the university to promote the free exchange of ideas by providing a balanced forum, and to strengthen our students' skills in debate, oral communication, and critical reasoning. I expect this event will successfully showcase the purpose of the program and the value of civil discourse. The North Carolina Study Center is an independent nonprofit at UNC that cultivates Christian life and thought. The center encourages the pursuit of truth, the formation of the person, and the common good. The Program for Public Discourse and the Study Center have worked together to bring you a conversation between two scholars who have considerable political, philosophical, and theological disagreements, but who are united by their Christian faith and their commitment to the free exchange of ideas. Dr. West and Dr. George are both public intellectuals who have had distinguished scholarly careers. They met each other when a Princeton student magazine invited Dr. West to interview a colleague for a feature article. Dr. West chose to interview his colleague, Robert George, whom he really didn't know very well. The interview, which lasted for 4 hours, led to a jointly taught course and to an enduring friendship. In an era when Americans are increasingly separating themselves along ideological and partisan lines, the ongoing conversation between Dr. West and Dr. George is an important example of public discourse and highlights the need for initiatives such as our new Program for Public Discourse. Tonight's conversation between Dr. West and Dr. George will be moderated by Thomas Chatterton Williams. Mr. Williams is an essayist, author, and journalist, and he was also one of the co-developers of the widely discussed Letter on Justice and Open Debate, which was recently published in Harper's Magazine. I'm sure you're going to find this evening's discussion insightful and engaging. Again, thank you for joining us, and now I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Dean Rhodes. It's such an honor to be here tonight in conversation with these two distinguished panelists. Thank you all in the audience for making the time to join us. And I want to thank Sarah Truhl and everyone else at UNC's Program for Public Discourse for so generously organizing and hosting this event. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. We will be answering audience questions around 6:30 p.m., but you can start submitting them as early as you like using Zoom's Q&A tool. A member of the UNC Program for Public Discourse is monitoring those questions and will get them to me when we transition to that part of the discussion. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, I honestly don't think we could be discussing an issue more urgent in this extraordinarily polarized moment than how to engage in meaningful and productive conversations across the political spectrum. How do we not demonize or dismiss our opponents and instead attempt to persuade them? Or if we're really being honest, how do we hold out the possibility that they might in turn persuade us as well? Dr. West and Dr. George, the two of you routinely model this kind of intellectual and moral generosity. So I want to just get right into it. What is it beyond personal friendship that makes your constructive dialogue possible? And how might it be replicable in situations where we may not have that kind of long-term relationship at play?
Cornel, would you like to begin, or?
No, you jump right in, my dear brother.
Okay, well, thank you. First, let me say, and I know I'm speaking for Cornel as well as myself, thank you to you, Thomas, for being willing to moderate our conversation today and to be part of what's happening in the program for public discourse at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I'm going to say a word about that in a minute. But Thomas Chatterton Williams has emerged as one of the leading voices of the new generation, the rising generation. And boy, do we need voices like his, the contributions that he is making, that those who are willing to step forward as he has in the chaos and cacophony and try to be reasonable and talk sense and listen to other people. This is so critically important. So Thomas, thank you for doing that and for being a model of it for your generation. Cornel and I are of a different generation, and one of the things that us older folk worry about is what's happening with the younger people. Is it all lost? What about these kids? And then we look at folks like yourself and we think it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're probably going to do better than we ever did. Maybe you'll.
If I do half as much, I'm going to be happy.
And Dean Rhodes, thank you so much for inviting Cornel and me to be part of your family down there in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, not only today, but of course you invited me to chair the committee to help design the program for public discourse. And when I recommended that we invite Brother Cornel onto that committee because his voice and contribution are so important, you of course immediately jumped and said, well, do you think he would do it? And I said, yes, I think he would do it. And so Cornel joined us, and we had a wonderful team of other people, both folks there at the university and folks from outside the university who joined us. And it was just a pleasure and a delight to work for this great cause of enhancing the quality of civic discourse, trying to promote a civility in our public debates that is not mere politesse, not mere politeness, but is a deep willingness, as Thomas said, not only to be kind to each other and willing to listen to each other, but even to consider the possibility that the guy on the other side that you're talking with might have something to teach you. He might be right, or at least right about some things. You might be wrong about some things. So it's really great to see the program up and running, and thank you again just for the honor of having a role in designing it and now having a role in launching it. Thomas, to get directly to your question, I can tell you exactly what the other thing is that's needed beyond the friendship, beyond the relationship. It's a shared commitment to truth and truth-seeking. That's it. You need to love truth more than your own opinions. You have to be willing to recognize that some of your opinions are wrong. That's true of every single person walking on the face of this planet, and every single person who ever has walked on this planet or ever will. They're wrong about some things. We're fallible. We don't have it all right. Now, the problem is we don't know which ones we're wrong about. If we fall deeply in love with our opinions, or too deeply in love with our opinions, we won't care which ones we're wrong about. We'll only care about our opinions prevailing. But if we love truth more than our opinions, then something important will happen. And that is an openness to listening to somebody who disagrees. An openness to being challenged and not simply to challenging. To being unsettled in one's beliefs. Listening to another person because you recognize with intellectual humility that one might be wrong not only about the minor matters of life, but even about one's deepest, most cherished, even identity-forming beliefs. This is fundamentally at the foundation of this wonderful relationship I have with Brother Cornel West. We disagree about various things, but I know something about him. He's not so deeply in love with his opinions that he values them over truth. Quite the contrary. He is committed to truth and to truth-seeking, and I want to be like that. I want to emulate what I see in Cornel West. And when you have two people who share that commitment to truth and to truth-seeking, then they've got something in common that binds them together much more powerfully than whatever it is that separates them. The economic issues or the social issues or cultural issues or religious questions, whatever they are. That common bond of truth-seeking is the most powerful uniter, and it produces the willingness to listen and engage that is certainly at the heart of the relationship that Cornel and I have. But over to you, Cornel.
No, indeed, indeed. Well, let me also add my feeble voice, but very, very strong conviction that it's a blessing to be back at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's a very special place, very unique institution. I want to thank Sister Dean Rhodes for her leadership. I want to salute Brother Jonathan. It's very important. He's brand new on campus, hitting the ground running. Sister Sarah and Brother Paul. And to be in dialogue with Brother Thomas. I've been reading him now for years. I get a chance to see him in the flesh. Even though he is in Spain, he is with us in both appearance, spirit, as well as in this dialogue. And it's true that I do take very seriously your voice. It's a challenge to me in many ways, and I try to measure my own views over against people I agree and disagree with. But the important thing is lifting your voice and having integrity step by step by step. And that's what I love about my dear brother Robbie, though. You see that he talks about love of truth, and love of truth is very much at the center. But I would want to add love of beauty, because I think that the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, but Rilke is right in terms of beauty being a fundamental response to terror, what it means to wrestle with trauma and terror. And all of us in some ways are terrorized and traumatized in various forms. To be human in a way is to shudder, as Goethe says. And that shuddering has everything to do with recognizing that we have fears, insecurities, anxieties in the face of being the culinary delight of terrestrial worms one day. And therefore, at the deepest level of our humanity, Brother Robbie and I meet, so that my love for him is not reducible to politics. I think he's wrong on a number of things. He thinks I'm wrong on a number of things. Fine, we wrestle, we struggle. But the love itself cuts so much deeper than politics, and the brotherhood, in some ways even deeper than the friendship. Because I think Aristotelian notions of philia don't even cut deep enough to capture the relation that Brother Robbie and I have. It really is a matter of brotherhood. And that's not reducible to agreement on public policy at all. And I think we're living at a moment in this American empire of such spiritual decay and moral vacancy. And by spiritual decay, I mean the relative collapse of the kind of vision and imagination that's exercised by means of empathy, the kind of thing that Percy Shelley was talking about at the end of his great defense of poetry. The poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They use their imagination to envision better realities by means of courageous action. And by moral decline, I mean the relative collapse of integrity, honesty, and decency. And I think I've been blessed to have a number of friends and brothers and members of family who serve as a bulwark against the spiritual decay, against the moral decline. And it's in relation. It's in very, very genuine coming together, not just as individuals, but as families. Robbie's relation to my daughter, my embrace of Cindy, his magnificent wife, and knowing his parents who are just jewels and gems. You see, when you reach that level of brotherhood, and it could be sisterhood as well, or it could be non-binary, human beings relating to one another, but we're talking about something that's deep. And that's what we need more of. And we need enactments of it. We need embodiments of it. So it's that love of truth, the love of beauty. And of course, as Christians, it's love of God and wrestling over how we understand the good. That's part and parcel of what it is to have access to certain joys in life before you die. And so that's a beginning, my dear brother Thomas, of what not only has brought us together, but how long is it now, my brother? Almost 15 years now, right?
Oh, it's more than that, Cornel, I think.
Is it more than 15?
No, you're right. It's about 15. You're right. It's about
15. About 2005, 2006.
That's when we started teaching together. Yeah, we knew each other a little before that, but
right. That's true.
2006, I guess.
Absolutely.
I'm struck by what you say about beauty, and there's a relationship between truth and beauty where the two are not necessarily distinct but are one and the same. Lies are not beautiful, but the truth is. But in that same vein, Robert, there can be a reluctance sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, to admit certain truths because they can be seen somehow as advantageous for the other side. Perhaps a good example of this that comes to my mind recently is a reluctance by some on the left even to criticize when the protests have turned violent in recent weeks. Can we walk back from this kind of tribalism that has us, there's a kind of taint by association or contamination by association in which your opponent, even if they're in possession of the truth or of a truth, cannot be acknowledged. And so I feel like that's a real barrier to dialogue before you can even get started.
This is such a critical question, Thomas, and I'm really glad that you asked it. And we see the problem now in bold, stark relief. People unwilling to criticize the movements or ideologies that they're broadly sympathetic to, or persons associated with those movements or in leadership positions in those movements, for fear of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Now, the beginning mistake there is to treat the people on the other side as the enemy. Those are your fellow citizens. There should be a civic friendship even among people who disagree. But we treat each other as enemies, not just as people who disagree. We treat each other as enemies, and then we're reluctant to say a mumbling word of criticism, no matter how deeply deserved, of those on our own side or of our own ideological position or the one adopted by the mainstream of our movements, for fear of helping people on the other side. And it happens, I'm a conservative, it happens on the right as much as it does on the left. You're absolutely right to see it on the left, the refusal to acknowledge the fact of the violence that's been going on the street for fear that it might help Trump or somebody on the other side. But we see it on the right as well. Sometimes the unwillingness to say a word of criticism, even of some of Donald Trump's worst delinquencies, lest we help Biden and the Democrats or help the left. Again, here's the key. Focus on the truth. Tell the truth. Insist on telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, sometimes people are willing to buy the first one of those. I'm going to tell the truth, but not the whole truth. I'm going to be silent on some truth. So I'm going to tell part of the truth. But no, it's got to be the whole truth and nothing but the truth. We don't embellish the truth out of some ideological goal or for some partisan purpose or something like that. But let me tell you something. I can tell you, Cornel will relate to this. If you're the truth teller, now you might be wrong, but if you're the honest person who's telling the truth as best you can understand the truth, you're not infallible, but you're going to tell the truth no matter which way it cuts. You're going to be in for grief like you don't know what, because your side is going to hammer you worse than anybody on the other side would. Because they're going to treat you as a traitor. You're going to be Judas Iscariot. You are a betrayer. You are the scum of the earth. You're the worst possible person. Why? Because you're letting the cat out of the bag, often, Thomas, about what everybody knows, but won't say. They won't say it out of partisanship, because they don't want to help people on the other side. But, my advice to you is be Cornel West. Tell the truth no matter whose ox is gored. Take the heat. You only live once. There's nothing more important than your integrity. If you speak the truth, that's your reward. You maintain your integrity. And whoever it was that came up with the aphorism, virtue is its own reward, is absolutely right. Because to have integrity is the greatest thing in the world. But let me tell you something else. I say this to my students and to my kids. Something about integrity. There are very few things in this life that other people can't take from you. They can take your wealth. They can take your reputation. They can smear you and ruin you. They can take away your family. But the one thing that you have that no one can take away from you is your integrity. there's only one way you can lose it. You give it up. It's like water being held in your cupped hands. It will remain there unless you open your fingers, and then it slips through, and then it's gone. Not because some enemy took it away from you, or not because of bad fortune, but because you made the decision to sacrifice your integrity for something else, for power, for influence, for prestige, for status, or to be a team player, to be thought well of by the group, to not be expelled from the community. So I see the key to the problem that you have identified, Thomas, as exemplars, role models, people who are willing to show, especially younger people, that integrity is something worth having and something worth sacrificing for. And those will be your truth tellers. And if we're going to be saved in this culture from this demonic polarization we are now experiencing, and this hatred people have for each other, if we're going to be saved from that, it's going to be because there are some courageous people who are willing to stand up and tell the truth.
Dr. West?
He's hitting the nails on the head, though. Integrity, honesty, decency, and courage. Now, it was the great Spinoza who said that. The reward of virtue is virtue itself. That intellectual explosion in the early modern Europe, excommunicated from his Jewish community, willing to tell the truth, willing to take risk in his writing as he's cleaning those lenses in his regular job, you see. The issue of the exemplars who generate the kind of inspiration so that we don't fall into the bondage of complacency, conformity, cowardliness. You can hear Ralph Waldo Emerson, whoso be a human being will be a nonconformist, but will be misunderstood. Same trajectory. Malcolm X, at the end of his autobiography, what does he say? I'm for truth no matter who says it. I'm for justice no matter who's for it. I'm a human being first. And then, yes, I'm a black man. Then, yes, but Malcolm, using what he has relative to his tradition, relative to his self-understanding, saying truth is bigger than him, which means we have to have some humility. Beauty, bigger than him. Goodness, bigger than him. For him, Allah. For me, Jesus. For bell hooks, Buddha, whatever it is. Or for my secular brothers and sisters, democracy, freedom. It's bigger than us. And so that sense of Socratic humility, which is an intellectual humility, that we could be wrong, and the sense of a prophetic tenacity, even if we are wrong, what we believe moves us to such a degree that we're willing to take a risk and even die for it. That's Martin King. I'd rather be a corpse than a coward. I'd rather be dead than afraid. You see, that's 11 and a loaf. Now, see, this is a challenge for every society, every empire, every civilization since the beginning of time. Who wants to be Socratic, headed toward the hemlock? Who wants to be Jeremiah, laughed at and he's weeping? Who wants to be Jesus, crucified? Who wants to be Fannie Lou Hamer, beat down like a dog? Who wants to be Rabbi Heschel, talked about, demonized by his own mainstream Jewish establishment as a rabbi? We have to be willing to pay that kind of cost, not in the spirit of self-righteousness, though, but because you find joy in bearing that kind of witness. We are in the state of the one and only John Coltrane, from Hamlet, from High Point, Love Supreme, Giant Steps, Train. What went into the making of you to such a degree that you're able to exemplify what Spinoza, what Martin King, what the others did in your calling? Exactly what Brother Robbie's talking about. Integrity. He's going to be true to himself. He's going to be true to the anthem of Black people in America, which is lift every voice. You can't be part of a freedom movement if you get upset when people exercise their freedom in terms of how they define themselves, in terms of how they proceed. in terms of how they orient themselves. They're lifting their voices, not echoes, voices. And so we have to try to keep in front of ourselves and our fellow human beings and fellow citizens, the great examples of integrity and vision and imagination. And it comes in all colors, all sexual orientations, all genders, all cultures, all national experiments. And those folk are the leaven within those respective loaves that give us a sense of the highest forms of what it is to be human, which is a very dangerous thing to talk about. Human, from the humando of the Latin, burying and burial, on the way to being corpses. Oh, wow, that's not too pleasant, is it? It's a beautiful trek from womb to tomb if you're able to revel in the humanity of others, wrestling with their non-conformity, their refusal to be complacent, their refusal to be cowardly, and their attempt to connect with others with a genuine love, not just of wisdom, but of neighbor, of family, of friends, of brothers and sisters. That's what Brother Robbie and I get a chance to talk about when we steal away. I drink my cognac, he drinks wine. I'm left wing of the Reformation. I'm Black Baptist, so we can hang loose. Robbie drinks wine. He's a Catholic brother. He's close to Aquinas. I'm close to Garden and Howard Thurman.
You know, Dr. West, you and Dr. George, I'm fascinated by this because you bring the stakes sky high, which is where I think that they should be. But we don't want to just sip the hemlock for any old reason over any old squabble. And so that makes me wonder, how do we discern between genuine issues that deserve our sustained attention and commentary and might even deserve our sacrifice because we don't want to spill that integrity out of our cupped hands? And how do we just figure out what it might be wiser to ignore, even public controversies that excite a lot of people around us? And then I wonder, is there ever a danger of being technically, factually correct in a small way, but missing some larger truth that might be even more important? How do we guard against this? I'm thinking, for example, of the controversy around the 19-year-old congressional candidate, Aaron Coleman, a few weeks ago, that burned fast and bright. This 19-year-old, when he was 12 to 14, had done some things that were pretty reprehensible, but for many of us, it seemed like there's a principle that we shouldn't be making people pay for things they've done as kids when they're adults. But he was barely an adult, and many people were very troubled by the ambiguity here. And I felt that, it seemed like when this controversy was over, everybody on every side of this issue, even if they felt like they had won, it was a Pyrrhic victory at best. No one really won. This was something that maybe we should have held back from engaging. How do we make these discernments so that we only really give ourselves up to what genuinely matters?
Well, before I address that question and before we move beyond this, I want to say that while I yield to no one in my admiration and my love of the great music of the great, incomparable John Coltrane, I want to note that in North Carolina, we're in the home state of Earl Scruggs and Doc Watson. Now, I'm a West Virginia boy, and that's my kind of music. And I would ordinarily say no non-West Virginian belongs in the pantheon of bluegrass musicians, but I'll make an exception for Earl Scruggs and Doc Watson.
I hear you, brother. Y'all got some fascinating things going on the vanilla side of town. They're fascinating things going on. Earl got a lot going on. We're going to go, I'm sorry.
Oh, he does. Yeah, he does. There's no question. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. His son, Randy Scruggs, also from down there in North Carolina, died recently, too young. He was in his late 50s, early 60s. I was so sorry to see that. He's a great bluegrass guitarist, actually. His father, of course, was the inventor of the bluegrass style of banjo.
Right.
Great bluegrass guitarist. But Thomas, to get to your question, again, another very important question. I think it is true that that issues including issues of social concern, certainly this is also true of personal issues, vary in their level of importance. Some things are relatively trivial. They're passing things, they're small things. Some things are grand, great, important, grave issues. But when it comes to integrity, there's not really a hierarchy. The hierarchy, I think, relates to how we should spend our time and where our attention should be focused and so forth. But on integrity, it matters as much on the small things as it does on the big things. My interaction with the gal in the shop who takes my money or my credit card when I buy my groceries, integrity in my relationship with her is every bit as important as integrity over great issues of how are we going to organize our healthcare system, or what's the correct environmental policy in these grand global sorts of issues, or at least national, if not global sorts of issues. Integrity is never optional, and sometimes it's got to be sacrificed for. You just have no choice. You're on the spot. You're under pressure, or you have an incentive, or self-interest is driving you to do something that violates your integrity. It's not permitted even on a minor matter. And when you yield, and when you allow your integrity to be violated, when you give it up, it's just as bad as had you done it for some big cause. Do you see the distinction I'm drawing here?
Yeah.
Integrity.
So you're saying that the hemlock, that can even happen over something that might be considered a smaller issue.
Right, that's right. If someone wants me to tell a lie in order for them to get their way on some minor matter of academic politics, and let's say this person is an old friend and this person is calling in a favor, or this person is somebody I'm going to need on a different issue of academic politics and I'm going to want him to support me. So he's saying, you know, what's the big deal? You're going to lie, but it's about a trivial matter. It doesn't matter. It's not as if you're lying about something really important. This is a trivial matter of academic politics. No, that's not how integrity works. I have no more right. It's just as bad to lie in that minor matter than it is in a major matter. I mean, that's the way character works. That's the way integrity works. That's why your mom and dad are so insistent. I know Cornel's mother.
Oh, Lord,
Irene
yeah.
West will tell you, you don't lie in the small things. You tell the truth all the time, even in the small things. Now, as Dr. Johnson pointed out, sometimes there's a way of talking, and it's not really lying, although it's not literally true. So if I sign off, this was Johnson's example. If my complimentary close in a letter is, I am, sir, your most humble and obedient servant, you may not actually be his humble and obedient servant, but it's a convention. It's a way of talking. It's like I don't lie if I'm a Shakespearean actor and I'm on the stage and I say, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him. That's not actually Robbie George didn't know Yorick. There was no Yorick, actually. But that's not a lie. But if someone would say, you need to tell a lie in order for me to persuade the rest of the faculty that we should alter the academic calendar and let's say move from an exams after Christmas calendar to what everybody else has now on exams before Christmas calendar. That's a relatively trivial issue in the great scheme of things. But it would be a deep violation of integrity to lie for that reason, whether the lie is motivated just by good fellowship, friendship, or a desire to get his vote the next time, or a fear that he might reveal something negative about me if I don't go along with him. There are lots of incentives, positive and negative, for people to do things that violate integrity, but you can't do them. When Irene West or Catherine George tells us when we were little kids, you don't do that. The answer to that, a good answer to that is not, but it doesn't matter really because it's minor and trivial. Cornel, are you on board with me on this?
Oh, absolutely. And I think a great example of that, though, Brother Thomas, is when my dear brother Mark Lamont Hill said controversial things in terms of his critique of the Israeli occupation and so forth. And Brother Robbie and I have very different views about wrestling with that complicated issue. But Brother Robbie was saying, Brother Cornel, when they try to take away this brother's tenure, and there was major attempts to do it, he said, I want to march down to Philadelphia with you to defend his right to say what he has to say. Not just because he believed what John Stuart Mill wrote in 1859 on liberty is something that needs to be taken very seriously, but also because he doesn't want to live a lie, which is to say that he believes in rights and liberties for persons with whom he has deep disagreements with. And so he wants to have that moral consistency of what the great Jane Austen called constancy. And that kind of consistency and constancy will usually be misunderstood. What is Robbie George doing defending Mark Lamont Hill? Well, he's not defending Mark Lamont Hill in terms of the content of what he said. He's defending his right to say it. And therefore, he's going to have the same kind of defense of a Charles Murray as he's going to have of a Mark Lamont Hill. Charles Murray, conservative brother, raising all kind of controversial issues. I think he's wrong on a whole host of them. I've had the public debates with him too. But the question of staying in contact with people's right to express themselves and their capacity to engage in dialogue, even when you have profound disagreements with them, is part and parcel of the courage, or what I call courageous witness. And that's just one example. I can give a whole host of examples in this regard, but it's a very important one. And this is true even with the Harper's Magazine piece that we were
That's what I was going to ask you.
Absolutely, the Harper's Magazine piece. Brother Robbie is already so fundamentally committed to rights and liberties. The way he ran the commission, so he's been committed to Muslims and Uyghurs in China and Dalits in India and the Roma and in Europe, based on his commitment to liberty. As a conservative brother, he and I come together profoundly in terms of defense of those same liberties and those same rights, right? But he would also want to say, let's say, to our liberal brothers and sisters, many of whom signed that statement, right? Are you going to be as committed to Mark Lamont Hill as you are committed to a Bennett who gets mistreated at New York Times or something like that? See, that's the level of consistency and Austen-like constancy that we're looking for in terms of integrity.
Yeah, let me add something to that. I think it's very important what Cornel is saying there. For people like Cornel and myself, and I think others who come out of deep philosophical or religious traditions, whether one is an Aristotelian or Christian or Jewish or Muslim, when we stand up for rights and liberties, we understand these things not as abstract principles, the way they're very often understood by contemporary libertarians. Not always, but very often. These to us are not abstract principles. Rights and liberties are important because of the underlying goods that they protect. So look at academic freedom. Look at freedom of speech on campus, something very much in jeopardy these days, something we have to push back hard against the impulse to suppress. Why do we fight so hard for academic freedom and for freedom of speech on campus? Because the truth-seeking enterprise, the good of truth itself, is what's at stake. Unless we have freedom to challenge, to unsettle, to question, to throw out an unorthodox opinion, to embrace an unorthodox opinion, we're never going to get at the truth of the questions that we're exploring. A groupthink will set in, an orthodoxy, a set of dogmas will set in that are the roadblock against getting to the truth. Same with the free exercise of religion. Cornel kindly mentioned my chairmanship of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. My work there, whether it was for our fellow Christians, Cornel and I are Christians, but for Jews against anti-Semitism, for Muslims, for Buddhists persecuted in Vietnam, for example, or in Tibet, for Hindus, We on the commission stood for the rights of all, not because there's some abstract right to religious freedom, but in order for those people representing those different traditions to pursue the spiritual goods, pursue the spiritual fulfillment that can only be gained by the free embrace of faith. We recognize that faith is not something that can be compelled. Faith is an interior act of intellect and will. You can force people to do certain external behaviors, to perform certain external acts, or you can forbid them from performing certain external acts, have a Passover Seder, or pray 5 times a day, or go to Mass, or whatever it is. But you can't compel those internal acts of intellect and will. All you can produce is inauthenticity in persons. So when we speak about the defense of rights and liberties, they are terribly, terribly important. But they're important precisely because of the human goods that are at stake in the exercise of those rights and liberties.
Thank you. I just, while we're on the Harper's letter, I just want to note that it was an enormous loss for us not to have realized that Dr. West had intended to sign it. And I just want to apologize on behalf of all of us who organized the letter, but your name will be added to the list of signatories online if it hasn't been already. And I wish in retrospect that we had reached out to you as well, Robert. But I wonder what both of you make of the kind of debate that took off around the letter that really became something of its own, took on a life of its own, and was even international in scope, and seemed to be way out of proportion to a kind of very basic and almost anodyne statement of extremely, I would think, uncontroversial liberal principles about the right to the kind of freedom of expression that you both were just mentioning, and that Dr. West mentioned in relation to Mark Lamont Hill, that basically anybody that believes in a liberal society has to be against censoriousness, illiberalism, and public humiliation and shaming. But this just statement, it sparked a kind of visceral reaction that I still haven't quite been able to put my finger on.
If I could say a quick word about this, and then Cornel should really address this at length.
Sure.
Hear his thoughts on this. My quick point is this: I was less surprised and less disappointed that the woke element, as they call themselves, or they're called, resisted what seemed to me just the straightforwardly commonsensical points that were raised in the letter. At this point, I realize they're not on board with basic rights and liberties. They've got a different agenda. The rights and liberties have to be sacrificed the way eggs need to be broken to make an omelet. That's their attitude. I get that. I'm sorry about it. But that didn't surprise me, or really that much disappoint me, since I wasn't expecting anything more. Here's what surprised and disappointed me: that there were some people who would not sign that letter, or who jumped off having signed it, if I understand this correctly, because they didn't want to be associated with other people who signed the letter. Now, what's that all about? What's that all about? Can't people realize that if they have some important common values, some important common ground, they can join together and unite despite their differences, and that other people are smart enough to realize that the fact that they agree on freedom of speech doesn't mean that they agree on every other important issue in life? That was really disappointing and surprising to me. But Cornel, you really...
No, I mean, and this is a crucial query, though, Brother Thomas. See, I think part of the problem here is that we have to realize the degree to which liberal and neoliberal elites are held in such profound suspicion and even in some ways contempt. Because the very decay and decline that I was talking about, the thing that Brother Bernie talked about in terms of the wealth inequality in his critique of Wall Street and so forth, that decay and decline has intensified under the rule of liberal and neoliberal elites, not just political, but also intellectual, including the university. And the university is a neoliberal university. And for the most part, there's a neoliberal hegemony in the university. Robbie's conservative brothers and sisters are not hegemonic in the university.
There sure are.
And my left wing folk aren't either. You see, it's the liberal and neoliberal ones who may engage in transgressive action in terms of their texts and so forth and so on, but their careers and their opportunism becomes more and more predominant in their behavior. And so people around the world have this deep suspicion and contempt. So then when Harper's comes along with very much liberal, well-meaning liberal intellectuals signing this thing, and they say, well, where were these liberal intellectuals when? Mark Lamont Hill was in trouble. Where were they in when? Other folk got done in with their rights were violated. Their voices were censored. We didn't hear them. So then they read the Harper's group as itself tribal. Oh, it's one of their friends when one of their friends at the New York Times gets in trouble and has their voice canceled that they get upset. Well, we've been out here getting canceled all this time and we didn't hear their voices, you see. So that it's, and all of our groups have their different forms of hypocrisy and self-righteousness. But you're at a decay really means when chickens come home to roost in such a way that nobody trusts anybody, that nobody gives anybody the benefit of the doubt, that nobody really thinks that anybody's really sincere. Everything is a crude Nietzschean will to power. Thrasymachus pushes Socrates off the cliff. It's all Thrasymachus. It's all will to power. Don't believe those folk when they talk about they were concerned about rights and liberties and freedom of expression. And so what Brother Robbie and I have tried to say is, no, we Thrasymachus cannot rule. The Grand Inquisitor will not be hegemonic. It's got to be something deeper than power, integrity, but always feeble in terms of its ability to change the world. And yet in the end, just like love itself in our own lives, it ends up being the most precious thing in our lives. And we got to be true to that. So the question becomes, what you gonna be true to? Just the power, even though it's the power of your group, as opposed to the power of another group? Or are you gonna be true to something deeper than power, which is truth and integrity and beauty and God? But of course, we know the history of religions and the way in which God has been deployed and weaponized as wills to power for empire and white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, and so forth. Well, what about the love? Well, love in the end is irreducible, is unstoppable, is unsuffocateable. That's the Christian story. The most powerful empire in the whole world is going to kill this particular Palestinian Jew and wipe him off the earth and wipe his memory off. And yet those little drops of blood at that cross still provide the way of love. And it just keep growing and keep growing. Here comes the Roman Empire, incorporates Christianity as a state religion. So now the prophets have to be against the state religion and the imperial Rome. But that love, justice still flowing. And we get the same story, of course, in the history of the American Empire in terms of Miles Horton, white brother, Rosa Parks, black sister, in solidarity together, tied to love, and the powers that be trying to crush both of them. And yet that memory keeps on going. Of course, University of North Carolina has its own versions of these stories of folk who held on with prophetic witness, lied on, and then having to undergo change and transformation. And any moment of change and transformation, of the folk who are initiating it begin to think they've got some monopoly on good. They've got some monopoly on truth. Time to Socratize.
I'm struck by your comments about will to power and Thrasymachus's might makes right kind of this zero-sum mentality that many of us bring to these conversations. And also, I think my dad is watching. My dad is always talking to me about Thrasymachus. So you made his night. Right?
We salute your father. Salute your father.
One thing we should do. One of my friends recently reminded me, someone who watches many of the dialogues that Cornel and I do, that we frequently bring up characters like Thrasymachus, but we don't pause to explain to people who may not have had the opportunity to read Plato's Republic or Plato's Dialogues who they are. So Thrasymachus is the character the sophist in Plato's Republic, who represents the view against Socrates' claims about justice, that justice really is simply the rule of the strong. It's the might makes right view. It would later be very powerfully articulated by Nietzsche in the modern world. So that's what Thrasymachus represents here, and this is what Cornel and I are pushing back against. It's what the great traditions of faith and philosophy have pushed back against. Plato and Aristotle represent the anti-Thrasymachus view. So does Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. And yet, it cannot be erased. It is always there, always coming back. Now, when something comes back all the time, pushing back a view like that, despite the fact that the great traditions of faith and thought in all of history have rejected it, it tells you something important. What it tells you is that way of looking at things is deeply embedded in here, in the human heart. That's why it won't completely go away. It always comes running back in. We're always tempted to give up on the alternatives and say, yeah, in the end, might makes right. We're all, at some level, Thrasymachus, even though we're all also struggling against Thrasymachus. The debate between Socrates and Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, that's a debate taking place in us all the time.
Absolutely.
But that's a good way to seg into my next question, which was, and I wonder if that's what you actually think is the biggest threat to civil discourse right now and in the foreseeable future, getting out of this zero-sum mentality. I mean, in this conversation that we have, many people would say it's Donald Trump, that he's the biggest threat to civil discourse right now. But it's certainly conceivable that when and if he's out of office, all of our discord won't be magically repaired. So is it this kind of this kind of might makes right, will to power, suspicion of all that's the greatest threat, or is it something else in fact?
The problem
I can rephrase that if that wasn't clear.
I think I get it. It's just a hard question. I mean, the easy part is this. It's not Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump didn't invent this. And we had it long before Donald Trump was even thinkable as a presidential candidate. Even here in our own culture, the decline into what Amy Chua calls, the Yale law professor Amy Chua, who's written a wonderful book on this, calls tribalism. What you earlier referred to, Thomas, as tribalism. That predates Donald Trump. So let's get that red herring out of here. We can criticize Donald Trump, but and he's certainly guilty of a high degree of incivility in the way he talks and tweets. He's not the only one, or it's not just on his side of the aisle either. But that's just, as I say, a red herring. We need to look at the deeper problem here. How did we get to the point where we abandon civic friendship and begin to view our fellow citizens, because they disagree with us, as enemies? Just as Americans did in the early years of the Republic, resulting ultimately in war, in a bloody civil war. Deep disagreement can produce that. I pray to God that it doesn't come to that this time, although I hate seeing the violence already breaking out. And who knows what happens after the November election, no matter how it comes out. But even if it doesn't descend into civil war in that nightmare, and I pray it doesn't, trust that it won't, it's not good. And it wasn't good long before Donald Trump. We had stopped seeing each other as fellow citizens. If you disagree, you are the enemy. Your fellow citizen's not your enemy. He's your political adversary. You disagree on some things, but you should think about some things that you agree on. Should look at those deeper sources of unity. And when you do that, you will then, I think, be able to see that where you disagree, you can nevertheless treat each other with respect. It's one thing to disagree with a view. It's another thing to demonize a person. We need to stop the demonization. Now, part of that, I think, really is showing up. Cornel's right about this. And here again, we need exemplars. That's why I looked at Cornel as one of these. We need people who will show up when they're not expected to be there. I mean, the reason that I said I will come and lead the march at Temple University to protest the firing of Mark Lamont Hill if he's fired, was that I knew it was important for people who were known to disagree with Mark Lamont Hill on the issue that got him into trouble to be there first in line, very visibly standing up for his rights. Same with Cornel and, say, Charles Murray. People expect libertarians to show up in defense of their fellow libertarian, Charles Murray, when he comes under attack at Middlebury College. That's not going to help a lot. What helps is when they see Cornel West show up, Cornel West speak out. Cornel and I, in the wake of that attack on Charles Murray and Allison Stanger at Middlebury, put out in 2017 our statement, Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression. It was in the wake of that to call attention to the need to listen to people who radically disagree with you and treat them with respect and not demonize them and certainly not attack them. My voice there was far less important than Cornel's, because Cornel came from the left side. Everybody expects people on the conservative side to speak out in favor of a conservative or a libertarian or in support of his rights, even if we disagree with the content of what he says. It's not expected that somebody on the left will, but that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. I mean, one way of putting that is all this talk about identity, that is severed from any integrity, that's severed from any courage, that cuts across tribalism, groupism, nationalism. Truth is bigger than any one identity. Even our human identity is still fallible. We could be wrong in that sense. And so what we're saying is if we unleash the Socratic energy and unleash the prophetic energy, which means it's coming at us in a critical way, unsettling us as well as unsettling others, but also acknowledging that it's always a risk. Because you see, for example, I mean, when you think of what we hear right now in the streets, you know, we got this marvelous multiracial, multicultural coming together, concerned about the public lynching of Brother Floyd and the killings and so forth and so on, arbitrary power policing and what have you. If you don't have the moral integrity and the spiritual substance, then it can just reinscribe itself into another narrow tribalism and groupism. Not just racial, but ideological. Not just ideological, but also national. We got to be concerned about folk who are dissidents in Asia and Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, whose rights are being violated, who the police are also shooting down. They're human beings, just like Brother Floyd and Sister Breonna. And so in that larger sense, I think it's a tough problem. And this is where the arts come in. I think in the end, you know, if our artists in this empire at this moment cannot come through, not just in what they produce, but in reminding us, what did Melville have in mind in the Pequod? Why did he see Ishmael at the end on that coffin serving as a raft? What did Mark Twain have in mind when he said, I would rather go to hell than give Brother Jim in? What's at stake in Toni Morrison's Sweet Home and that barbaric plantation? What is Faulkner really talking about in terms of the two saddest words, was and again? They've already shattered our innocence. Baldwin said you can't be an author of the devastation and view yourself as innocent. That innocence itself is a crime before you commit a crime. But he's not all alone. The best of the American artists did it. Eugene O'Neill has already said that in The Iceman Cometh in Harry Hope's Saloon. What happens when the addiction to stimulation and titillation overcomes our capacity to care and nurture for each other? Read that play. What American history is catching up with our American literary figures. And we haven't even got to the music yet. Oh my God. From Louis Armstrong to Sondheim, from Dorothy Fields to Aretha Franklin. How can we be true to ourselves and not live a lie? You can't live a lie and be a blues man. Can't live a lie and be Brother Earl Scruggs. No. He had to dig deep in his soul in order to produce the music he did. But he also needs to be criticized just like us, because he can accommodate himself to certain forms of evil, whatever it is, male supremacy, white supremacy, whatever. So that's the kind of vulnerability, invincibility, and openness we must have. And when we have public spaces that don't allow that anymore, which is what we have now, then what happens? Not just polarization, gangsterization. Back to Thrasymachus, your fathers, one of your fathers rightfully understood the figures we got to wrestle with, you see. And that's a spiritual condition, it really is.
It is, and you know, I've got to get to the audience questions now, but speaking of spiritual, last but not least, I'd be remiss if I don't ask you about the role of Christian faith in all of this. I'm particularly wondering what will bind us in the absence of a shared faith, or if the notions of forgiveness and grace that Christianity exemplifies are even possible in an increasingly secularized society such as ours.
Yeah, I'll be happy to address that very difficult question. But I want to say a couple of things first, just in sort of reaction, just stimulated by what Cornel said. One is, I just think it's terribly important for all of us to remember that there is no cause, Christianity, anti-slavery, anti-racism, there is no cause so noble and so virtuous that it cannot be discredited by bad behavior in support of the cause. There is always the temptation to use low and unworthy tactics, unjust tactics, commit injustices. Cornel and I said this recently in our statement, Honesty and Courage. There's always the temptation to believe my cause is so noble and important, and it may be really noble and important, but there's no cause so noble and important that it can't be discredited by unjust action. The best example to me is the cause of anti-communism. Now, there was a noble cause. If you know anything about the history of communism, if you know what the body count was, it dwarfs Hitler. You look at what the corpses piled up under Stalin and Mao Zedong and Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh. When you look at the death toll from communism, it is scandalous beyond belief. Fighting the Soviet Empire, fighting against communism, fighting against communist expansionism was a noble cause. But figures like Joe McCarthy and others discredited that cause, brought it into disrepute in some circles, hurt the very cause they wanted to help by their low tactics, by smearing people, by defaming people, by making false accusations, by abusing office, by abusing power. When the words anti-communism are spoken today, even for my students for whom communism and the Cold War are ancient history, instead of thinking of figures like Václav Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and John Paul II, or even John F. Kennedy or Adlai Stevenson, they think of Joe McCarthy. That's how a good cause can be discredited. So no matter what your cause is, you need to bear that in mind. And then the second point that I think is terribly important to bear in mind is this. Every single one of us, those of us who are visible on the screen and everyone who's behind it, is wrong about some things. There are some beliefs they have that are wrong. There's some beliefs I have and Cornel has and you have, Thomas, and everybody out there has that are wrong. And it's not just, there's no guarantee that it's just the superficial and trivial things. We're likely all wrong in one way or another about some very important things. So you might say, well, then why don't you change those beliefs and get in line with true beliefs? But of course, the obvious answer is because we don't know which ones are the wrong ones. And that's why it's so important not to shut your critics down or to demonize them or cancel them or make it impossible for them, especially in institutions of learning, schools and colleges and universities, but more generally throughout the culture. That's why it's so important to listen and engage and be open to being challenged and even to changing your mind. If we're going to get from false beliefs, which all of us have some of, including about some important stuff, to true beliefs, then we're going to need to be opened up by our interlocutors. And beyond that, not only should we be willing to be unsettled by people who challenge us, we need to become our own best critics. This is what I love about Cornel's teaching. I've taught with Cornel, so I can tell you about this. What Cornel teaches his students to do, what I try to teach my students to do, is to become their own best critics. So they are the ones questioning their own beliefs. Sometimes students, in the beginning especially, will resist that because they fear that if they question their own beliefs or allow their beliefs to be questioned, if they become their own best critics, they'll be paralyzed into inaction. They won't be able to stand for anything. They won't be able to have the courage of their convictions because they'll constantly be doubting. But if you look at the experience, again, of someone like Cornel, who stands up for his beliefs, even gets arrested for his beliefs as much as Cornel does. But he does that without being a dogmatist who's unwilling to hear a challenge or listen to a critic or consider that he might be wrong, even about something that he's prepared to go to jail for. That's the proper attitude. We don't have to worry about paralysis. We can be our own best critics and still act for justice and the common good and human rights and the things that we believe in. Cornel, you should address the question about Christianity.
No, you spoke with eloquence, though. No, I can speak for myself as a Christian, as a product of the West family and Shiloh Baptist Church and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Love Coates, and Reverend Blair, John Coltrane's grandfather. You know, Coltrane actually moved into post-Christian spirituality, but he was rooted in the AME Zion Church there at High Point and in Hamlet. And I think the thing to say there is very much the fundamental message of Chekhov. And Chekhov was not a Christian. He was rooted in Christianity, but he was not a Christian. He would go to church and say, the passion is too beautiful to be true. He was moved by the love, but he couldn't believe the consolation and the conclusion. And what sits at the center of Chekhov? Absolute condemnation of no one. That's why he doesn't condemn his characters, even when they're gangsters, because he knows they have the capacity to be different. And he knows there's a gangster element inside of him. So when he's critical, people are critical of Trump. Yes, he's a neo-fascist gangster. Well, there's a whole lot of gangsters in the world. There's going to be a lot of gangsters in the world, and there's some gangster in you. Check yourself. You see. And folk who support, so that don't be so surprised by evil. Don't be paralyzed by the despair that can flow from it. Chekhov teaches us, and the blues teaches us the same thing in the U.S. context, right? That you can acknowledge just how gangster-like people are, but it's not this kind of canceling and absolute condemnation as if you sit on some pure throne and are dispensing judgment. That's not the way the world is. You're going to end up living a lie yourself. And to live a lie is like Hamlet. What is the lie that Hamlet lives? He suffers from the inability to love. Can you imagine going from womb to tomb and not cultivating the ability to love? That's part of Trump's problem. He's joyless. I saw that in Charlottesville with the neo-Nazi brothers and sisters spitting at us and calling us all kind of N-word and everything else, even though they listen to Motown on the side, but that's a whole nother issue. That's a whole nother issue. Yeah. But you look in their eyes and you see what? A joylessness. God, I would never want to live a life like that. Full of lack of joy, obsessed with power and conquest. Do you know what it's like to be human at the most fundamental level? Now, as Christians, we see that in the love of God and the love of Jesus, but there's other grand examples as well. And of course, our Jewish brothers and sisters say that we Christians, we got a lot of examples for y'all. You could have gone with Hillel rather than Jesus. You could have gone with Baal Shem Tov rather than Jesus. They full a lot of love too. They're right about that, but I'm with Jesus. That's what we won't get into that. But the crucial thing is no religion has a monopoly on it, but we're dealing at this deep level of what it means to be human. That's why there's more love in Chekhov than there are in many Christian churches. And he's agnostic.
That was I mean, that's as good a point to end our conversation and move into the audience questions as I can imagine. Can you tell us about something you passionately disagree about, and then show us how you would discuss it?
Bernie Sanders, socialism. Cornel is the honorary chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. They've got a whole agenda of economic and other beliefs. I don't think I share any of them. In many cases, we agree on the ends, but don't agree on the means. I agree with my socialist friends that we should be fighting poverty. We cannot be complacent in the face of poverty. I even agree that we need, in a complex society like ours, a safety net that does involve government involvement. I'm with that. But I believe fundamentally that the market is the mechanism that will lift and has lifted millions of people out of poverty, and that we will kill the goose that laid the golden egg if we kill the market economy and go with a socialist public ownership system. Now, having said that, I am not a laissez-faire libertarian. That's a view in the opposite direction, at the opposite extreme, that I also reject. My view is one that perhaps would be predictable for a Catholic Christian. It's neither socialist nor laissez-faire. It's skeptical of concentrations of power in government, but also skeptical of concentrations of power, and wealth translates into power in private hands. And you can see that sometimes abuses occur because of private concentrations of wealth that are abused. I'm for a just economic system, but I think a just economic system will be fundamentally a market system. That regulation will be warranted when it is necessary to avoid exploitation, abuse, unfairness. But unless there's a very good justification in terms of preventing one of those things from happening, the government should let the market determine outcomes. So I don't know if that technically makes me a capitalist or a believer in capitalism, but I certainly believe in the market economy, and I believe in it not because I think people have an abstract right to capitalist acts between consenting adults. It's not the libertarian argument, but because of the good that I think it does and is capable of doing when properly regulated. Now, I realize there are reasonable people of goodwill, like Cornel, who disagree with me. Now, they want a bigger role for government, but Cornel can speak for himself. He probably also doesn't go to the extreme of complete government ownership. He sees a place for the market. He probably more likely to see it as a necessary evil. I see it as good. But Cornel, you speak for yourself. I shouldn't speak for you about this.
Well, I mean, one is that I got such a deep love of Dorothy Day that comes right out of the same tradition that produced Brother Robbie. He's got a deep love of Martin Luther King Jr. It comes out of tradition that produced me, and we overlap with the great Gilbert Keith Chesterton, who has a deep suspicion of the concentration of power in the public sphere, rightly so, the authoritarian government. We're seeing that right now. And we've seen it for a while with the imperial presidency in both parties. And a deep suspicion of domination and concentration of power in the economy with monopolies and crony capitalism and various ways in which big business tends to follow a greed rather than a commitment to public interest and common good. We all, both of us, have a deep agreement on those kinds of issues. So the question then becomes, how do we talk about markets in such a way that they're not fetishized? We don't ascribe magical powers to them. We recognize they're a human construct like anything else. And he's right. I think that markets do play an indispensable role. But at the same time, when they are colonized and dominated by big business, they're not really markets at all. They just become stepping stones for corporate greed and Wall Street greed. And that's why I love my dear brother Bernie, because he knows his own party, as well as the Republican Party, has been colonized by big money and Wall Street and lobbies and so forth and so on. And that's a certain kind of truth telling. But in the end, markets are going to play an indispensable role in heterogeneous populations that are large. It's not going to be, and that's one of the ways in which you can hold off authoritarian rule, be it government or be it in the economy with monopolies. Now you can imagine we could teach a whole seminar on this thing, but that's one of the issues that we do wrestle with. Of course, abortion is another crucial one. The brother Robbie has a profound moral passion in terms of the unborn, and I can appreciate moral passion. I just have a very different conception of dealing with that issue vis-a-vis women's control of their bodies and those precious babies on the way. When do they become babies? Then we have struggles and so forth. But those would probably be two. And I'm sure there's a host of others as well. But I know we got to open up for questions.
Yeah. So this one is for Professor West. Professor West, at various times, both you and Professor George have told the charming story of how you came together as real friends. To wit, a Princeton student asked who of all your Princeton colleagues you would most like to interview, and you replied, Robbie George. But as far as I know, you have never explained in public in detail why it was Professor George whom you selected. What was it about him that made you choose him out of all the many brilliant Princeton faculty members you could have named? Was it something in his work or personality or both?
Well, I wouldn't overestimate the talent of Princeton faculty across the board. I mean, gee, good God Almighty. We've got some brilliant ones, but I mean, you know, mediocrity has a way of finding itself in a lot of high places, no matter what color. But no, I was just curious. I think we had just been in a seminar together. I don't know whether it was Hannah Arendt or something like that. And he'd ask some questions. I'd ask questions. I was sorry I didn't get a chance to talk with him after. And I knew he has a deep appreciation of people who I appreciate, like an Edmund Burke or a Chesterton and what have you. So I'd figure we'd have a wonderful conversation. I had no idea that it would lead toward 15 years of deep brotherhood and families coming together, love and so forth. I had no idea. That's the Holy Ghost kicking in there. But I was just curious. That's all.
So this one is for Professor George. Given that you and Professor West are now famous for a friendship that transcends race and politics, do you think that God himself chose you two as instruments to model tolerance in very troubled times? Have you two ever discussed in private or in public what role God may have played in bringing you two together? Do you think God whispered to your colleague, choose Robbie George?
Well, as a Catholic who tries to be a faithful one, I do believe in apparitions, but I've never been blessed with one. Nor has God ever whispered anything into my ear. I frequently hear from people who tell me that God said this to them or God said that to them, and God bless them. I wish I would get those kinds of direct messages. But as a Christian, as a believer, I do believe in providence. I believe God's hand is in human affairs. When there's good being done, when there's fruit being produced, good fruit being produced, that's not a purely human thing. We are God's instruments. And I think the Christian vocation is to allow yourself to be an instrument in God's hands, because we trust him, because he is good. Good in a way that so profound that we can't ourselves understand it, much less achieve it. So I can't say that God told me to get together with Cornel, or that God has whispered into my ear or sent me a message saying the work with you and Cornel are doing together is great. Attaboy. Give Cornel my best regards. And yet, do I sense the hand of providence in something as productive and wonderful in my own life as my relationship with my brother? Well, yes, I do. And I can tell you when we do speak to each other, very often, in our private conversations, on the phone these days, or when we were able to get together before the COVID-19 pandemic, we do talk about our efforts to allow God to use us individually and our partnership, our relationship, our brotherhood as an instrument. We pray together. When we were able to get together in person, we always prayed together privately before each event. I'm saying this publicly for the first time now. It's not something we advertise or make a big deal out of. We don't want to show that sort of thing off, but since your questioner asked about it, yes, we're Christians. We believe in the power of prayer. We want to be in line doing God's work, doing what he wants us to do. So we pray for his blessing on our partnership, on our conversations, on our work. And we pray for each other, and we pray for each other's families. Irene West, Cornel's mother's in my prayers every evening when I pray for my parents and for elderly parents of other friends of mine. A particular friend in the classes department here at Princeton who has elderly parents that he's caring for, and I always remember them in my prayers. I have a friend out in Oregon who's caring for an elderly mother. I always remember her mother and her in my prayers, and I know that Cornel does the same. But Cornel, again, speak for yourself on this.
No, indeed. I think that each time we get together right before a presentation and pray that we would get our egos out of the way and allow God to use us in such a way that we might be able to touch somebody's heart, mind, soul, and body so that they are empowered. It's an echo of what I learned in Vacation Bible School. If the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And that's what we attempt to do. We leave whatever heaven that we can behind. But we also pray, as Brother Robbie said, on personal matters. When I went through the hospital when he was in New York City.
Oh, yeah.
And at the very, very end,
I was
it
almost,
yeah, absolutely. You had to push, to the edge to such a degree you had to call the priest in and wonder whether you got the last rites and so forth. I said, oh, my brother. Now, of course, I've been praying for the abolition of poverty for 67 years, so you can see how effective my prayers can be on certain fronts. But we prayed right there in that hospital room. We called for help. Psalm 121, you see. And so in that sense, as Christians, we do have the audacity to believe and live such that we are in connection with something bigger than us. And in that sense, that's different than God whispering in my ear. You know, that's taking it a bit too far. But certainly as fallen, finite human beings, we pray to be used in such a way that we might be able to leave a little heaven behind, whatever form that heaven takes. It could be a Socratic heaven, it could be a Christian heaven. It could be a whole host of ways in which people are empowered in their own quest for dignity and sanity and some integrity before the worms get their bodies.
You know, a very important role that prayer plays in our lives and in our partnership is this. Cornel and I have fancy academic appointments. He's at Harvard, I'm at Princeton. We have chairs and so forth. We have platforms. People come to hear us. People get in touch with us. People on our respective sides of the political spectrum, very often, until we say something unorthodox, will praise us and lionize us. We've both gotten a lot of applause. And applause is a very dangerous thing. Praise and approval is a very dangerous thing. It's every bit as addictive as heroin. When you get a bit of it, you want more of it. And very often people's unwillingness to break with the orthodoxy, what tethers them to the dogmas, is fear that if they deviate, if they say something that upsets the people who've been cheering and applauding them, the cheers and applause will stop. And then what will I be? I'll be an outcast. For people who are in the line of fire of applause, who are in danger of being applauded too much by the partisans on their own side, or by anybody really, having God in the picture, being able to pray that our egos get put aside and that we speak only truth, that we allow ourselves to be God's instruments come what may, that's terribly, terribly important. It's the thing that can keep you from getting, and I don't know anything else that really can keep you from getting addicted to that drug of applause and approval and praise. I want young people in particular to remember what I just said.
Very important.
I hope you'll
Very
remember what
important.
I said. Young people out there, I mean, applause is a drug. You can get addicted to it. It will destroy your character because you're going to want more of it, and it will be the thing that prevents you from truth-telling, truth-speaking, when the truth violates what people on your side, whichever side that is, conservative, progressive, libertarian.
That's right. That's right. And being true to yourself. As John Coltrane played my favorite things, they came by the thousands. When he started playing Interstellar Space, they walked out. He said, I got to be true to myself. I'm working on something inside of me. I'm not just blowing my horn to titillate you all. This is not entertainment. This is self-critical exploration and self-experimentation as it relates to my conception of myself and for him, God loves me. So that's another grand North Carolinian example. Yeah. I know we got some other North Carolinian examples too of what it means to hold on to his sense of integrity even over against the declining popularity.
That's an extraordinarily important point. At this point, we have time for one last question, but I want to ask.
That's fine. That's fine, no brother.
When we're wrapping up, so you can respond to a quick pair of questions about today's event, and those will pop up on your screens shortly. So the last audience question is in many discussions around race recently, both sides seem to be talking over each other. One group is saying, we need to move past race. That's the goal. Why do you want to keep making everything about race? The other side is saying, we focus on race so much precisely because society made everything about race first. Trying to ignore race denies that fact. So how do we move past this so we can begin a true and meaningful dialogue?
There's a book that I want everybody to read on this subject. It's called, I'll get it here in a second. Oh yes, Self-Portrait in Black and White by Thomas Chatterton Williams. There's the text to begin with. Thomas, this is not to flatter you. This is a direct hit from this person's question. Read that and then start reading reviews and reactions to that, and you will begin to get into what is rather a deep issue here. There's not a straightforward answer to that question, yes or no. It's not a yes or no question. That's a complicated question, and the most we can hope for is a deeper understanding of the question. I say that not to be evasive, or as I say, to flatter Thomas, but just to mark the fact that we're dealing with a complex reality here because we've got a complex history. It's very silly to deny that we have a complex history or that history is not relevant today. It's equally silly to suppose that racialism is going to be our way out of this, that it's going to heal the wounds. No, you're not going to get rid of race. And you wouldn't really want to, given the cultural background, given the cultural traditions. On the other hand, race itself can be enslaving. It can trap us. It can trap us into the kind of identitarianism that, as Cornel rightly pointed out a few minutes ago, undermines integrity. When Cornel says we're hearing too much about identity and not enough about integrity, boy, does he hit the nail on the head. So don't pretend, don't imagine there's going to be a straightforward question. We can solve this problem by never thinking of race, or by racialism, by thinking about race all the time and making race the central thing in every issue. It's not going to be either of those things. And there's not going to be a clean, clear answer to it. But we can get to a much better place than we are today if we think critically. Begin with Thomas's book, and then just think your way critically through these issues.
Absolutely. And I would put it this way, that we've got to somehow make the connection between one love and love is many things. Integrity is not unanimity. Integrity is variety and multiplicity grounded in integrity. You see? So when you mention my dear brother's book, please read his book. Some of the greatest minds wrestling with race have said we got to go beyond it. Paul Gilroy, who's my very dear brother, against race. We brought him to Harvard. I was first one that we had a seminar on his text. Gene Toomer, one of the finest of all literary artists of the 20th century, no matter what color. He was trying to get beyond race. Well, they had integrity in their search. They just ended up in a different place than somebody like a James Baldwin. I would say Fire Next Time as a text to read, because you get the same kind of integrity there, but he's got a different conclusion in terms of what it means to go beyond black and white. It's different than Gene Toomer. It's different than Paul Gilroy. that's still part of the same tradition, the same family of voices that are wrestling with integrity in terms of who they are. Just make sure that your life is not a fake and a phony and a fraud. That's the key. That's what it is to be a jazz woman. See, ain't nothing fake about Sarah Vaughan when she's doing her thing. Nothing fake about Brother Thomas and what he's doing. Now, I may not always agree with my brother. That's all right. He's part of the family. He's part of the tradition. He's wrestling with integrity in terms of his understanding of what it means to be human at that level. That's where we have to proceed no matter who we're talking about. This is true for white brothers and sisters. This is true for brown, indigenous people, Asians, or whatever. But if it's just a matter of using and weaponizing race and racial discourse for a will to power, then we all slide down the slope to chaos and more contempt, more hatred. No democracy can survive. In the end, no life of integrity can survive. You're going to live a lie. You're going to live a lie. And there's an intimate relation between mendacity and mortality without a mediating stage of integrity.
I can't think of a better note to end it, and unfortunately, it's time we have to end it. I'm floored by the wisdom and generosity that you two bring. It's clear that you both deeply care for each other, and you both have so much to say. I could sit here listening all night. So thank you very much for that.
We thank you. We thank you, brother. You did a marvelous job, man.
And I hope it's going to be the beginning of many more conversations for the audience to go and conduct on their own. And thank you one more time to Dean Rhodes, Sarah Truell, and UNC's very necessary program for public discourse. Good night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.